We are very sorry that we don't have more of a break scheduled for you guys today, but for the active participants, we want to remind you that this workshop and then the keynotes are going to be recorded and they're going to be on our YouTube channel after. So don't feel like you have to be like in your seat glued to the screen at all times. Because we definitely want you here for the one-on-one feedback session with your volunteer mentors. Also, apologies for the confusion. Yesterday, the only like real quote requirement is to bring a draft statement of purpose. And whatever you have is fine. Don't worry about it. Your volunteers will just work with you, even if it's just as high level as just talking about what you might want to brainstorm. And the last thing is, I think there was also some confusion about how to ask questions for the webinar events. We are going to prioritize questions that get asked in the chat, but honestly, you can ask questions however you like through the chat, through the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to get to those. But sorry for the confusion.
Yeah, and for an easier viewing experience of the webinar, you may find it helpful to open up your Zoom settings and then under the video tab, check the box that says hide video from I think it's non-presenting participants. So that way it will just be Lauren, myself, and the screen share, as opposed to the 37 people with their videos off and then us two in the screen share. So it just might be a little easier to see. But yeah, did we miss anything, Lauren, or are you ready to go? All right, so without further ado, welcome back, everybody. It is an honor to speak once again and hopefully to share some more fun ideas. In a similar vein of yesterday, we're going to be talking about your research, communicating your science. I'm really, really glad to be here and hope that you enjoy this presentation.
And we also really hope that this will not only benefit you in writing for your graduate school applications, but just throughout your career for years to come, for decades to come.
Yeah, I mean, communicating your science is a skill to build over a lifetime. And one of the sort of motivations for us to give this talk is that it turns out that talking about your research is a different skill set from doing your research. So there's a difference between knowing your stuff, but then to be able to communicate that effectively with other people who haven't seen it before is actually kind of a disjoint skill set. And so we're going to pay a lot of attention today about strategies you can use.
That being said, this skill set is universally transferable. You can basically apply it to any kind of scientific communication, which now especially is quite a broad spectrum. It can be anything as formal as a conference talk or a paper, a grant proposal, to more informal things, just like general public science communication, teaching, press releases, and now, as you guys are seeing, increasingly things like Twitter threads.
Yeah, it's more important now than ever for scientists to be able to communicate their work, not only with one another, but the general public. And so hopefully you'll find these very salient as you go forward in your careers. And so some quick caveats that we want to get out of the way is that we are not trying to present some singular hegemonic style of how you should talk about your science and what good science communication looks like. There is not only one way to be a successful scientific communicator. There are as many different styles of successful communication as there are people. You may think back to people who you have seen be very successful communicators, and most likely they had a lot of things that were unique to them, or that they didn't necessarily have that much in common. So different speakers use humor to great effect. Others have really flashy and eye-catching graphic design. Others give very technically dense but very crisp, information-rich talks where you feel like it's just being downloaded into your brain very effectively. Some people use body language or personal stories and anecdotes to great advantage. It helps to build rapport with the audience, so on and so on. I mean, our goal is to have, the 50 of you who are watching this talk, we don't want 50 voices that all sound the same. We want to have 50 different voices that all are armed with a good set of core principles and tools such that they can best actualize their own voice, your own voice.
So the format of this talk is going to be in 3 parts. First, we're going to basically just walk through a really quick example that's actually happened to one of us, and will probably happen to you in the near future when you visit a grad school and you're talking to a professor. Next, we're going to actually take a step back and go back to thinking just very broadly about your research and your work, and then break that down into 5 core components, 5 very broad ways of thinking about it, that will then build back up into several different common formats that you're going to encounter as a scientist by selecting from these 5 ingredients. Okay, so you are visiting the grad school of your dreams, and you run into a professor in the hallway and they say, "Oh, I see you're a new grad student. Welcome to the University of LAW. What are you interested in working on?"
Well, actually, Professor New, I was interested in working with you.
Oh, hey, that's wonderful. So tell me, what have you been working on in your undergrad?
Right. So freeze frame here. So at this point, you now are trying to talk to the professor that you want to work for and do research with. And so it's on you to give a summary of what you have done already. So it's entirely possible that you might give an answer something like this. Oh, well, so in my most recent project, basically we were solving these integrals that describe laser cooling. And so it's a triple integral over different directions. And so we're solving an optimization problem by numerically searching over different laser configurations to find the lowest temperature possible. And this involved a lot of numerical coding in Python. And we just submitted this work to PRA. So this is not an altogether, this is not like an altogether bad response, but there are some ways that we could tighten this up. So to work through some of the imperfections or areas of improvement in an answer like this. So we start off by diving right into, what the research kind of is about. That is, I was solving integrals that describe laser cooling. The question is, why were we doing this? Why were we solving these integrals? What was in it for us? What were we interested in? Now, the second line provides some more detail about the method described in the previous sentence, but not about the ultimate aim. So we're still missing some context with which this information can be set against. Next, we learn that there's an optimization problem. So evidently, we are solving these equations to some end. We know that we're trying to find a lowest temperature possible. Okay, so that sounds like that's going in the direction of something useful, but why this ultimately matters and to who it matters is not made clear yet. In the next sentence, we see that, okay, we have something that is descriptive of the day-to-day. We are doing numerical coding in Python. So okay, that's useful for a professor to hear. But again, this new information is still being put upon a shaky sort of Jenga tower foundation. And lastly, we don't know too much about what the research was about or why we should even care. It is good, see our previous points from the SOP talk yesterday, that you want to own the deliverables, own the positive things that came out from your research. We mentioned that there is a paper coming out, so we know this was successful, but we could do a little bit better for the rest of the paragraph about what the research was about. So here's a rewritten version of that previous statement. And so we can tick through one by one through the sentences to see what was done better. So now we know, the who and the what. Okay, we were working with Professor blank at blank on blank in order to gain better ion trap temperatures to get better measurements. So, okay, we know that we are trying to work towards higher quality measurements. And next, we need to know how laser atom interactions affect temperature. So the objective of the research is clearly stated. We are building our understanding of laser atom interactions in order to optimize our experimental setup. So to save time in lab, okay, this motivates what follows. So it's not like, oh, we were just doing guess and check. We were retooling the configuration of our apparatus until we got to a lower temperature. No, that is majorly limited by efficiency. So that behooves us to study it computationally so that then we can save time in the lab. That just takes too long. Here's a better way to do it. So we set up a series of model integral equations and solved them numerically. So now we're talking about the mathematical approach. We're back in the weeds and the details of what was actually being done, but it's set against a firm background and a sort of better foundation about why it's important for us to solve these integrals. And now the punchline of what we get out of the work, that is, we found an optimal setup and lowest possible temperature, is very clearly stated. So we now know that, oh, okay, we understand why we care about this, why it's useful, and more about the context of this research. So again, I hope you liked this joke yesterday, because here it is again. But yeah, no, like these are two different versions of the same research, two different ways of talking about the same research. And so it's normal to sort of feel like you're put on the spot sometimes when you need to talk about your own research, but this can be the difference that the preparation and forethought can make in how that ultimately comes across in owning the work that you did.
So now we're going to zoom out a little bit, and you saw some of these in action in what Stephen just said, but these 5 core components, let's really break down what they mean. So ultimately, talking about your research it's about talking about what you know best. So these are projects that you've spent months, maybe even years working on. And it is ultimately important to have a sense of the broader structure about how you can think of your research before you talk to others about it, because then it'll be clear how you want to deploy these individual components based on who your audience is. So questions like, oh, what question is your research specifically answering? What tools and methods are you using? And of course, why should we care about this research? Why should people fund this research? Why should people hire you to do this kind of research? So these 5 components that we're going to cover should be applicable to basically every research project, we think. And as we talk through this, maybe you can think about how these will map onto things that you've been working on. And also doing this kind of breakdown will be especially important as you continue on in your career. Often grant proposals, for instance, fellowship applications as well, a lot of prizes will actually ask you to break down your work explicitly into these 5 ways.
Right. Yeah, one thing that's just coming to mind is that like the NSF application asks you to think about intellectual merit and like broader impact, and thinking about how your work goes alternately into both buckets can be very important for how you ultimately might apply for grants, particularly with the NSF. But it's not just limited to them, like this kind of sort of like dichotomy and way of picking things up. So, a big part of the promise of science is that ultimately it can help us improve people's quality of life, and it helps us answer fundamental questions about the world around us. Now, a lot of what we do every day doesn't necessarily engage with those big picture questions, like, oh, you're debugging your script or you're pipetting things, like that maybe doesn't feel like you're getting in touch with like profound truths about the universe. But when you're talking about your research, it's important to remember exactly how to communicate the big picture impact and concern of your work. So you can think of this sort of domain of answering the following questions about your field and about your work. What is motivating your general research area? What is your field ultimately working towards? What would the impact for the world be if the research that you're working on were wildly successful 5, maybe 10, maybe 20 years out? Could this mean better cancer treatments available in a clinic? Could this mean a better understanding and possibly curing some strain of cancer entirely? So our professors have to think about this all the time, in particular with justifying the research program that they are undertaking. And oftentimes when applying for funding. So, for instance, the federal government is a large funder of research, and being able to make the clear case as to why taxpayer dollars deserve to fund your research isn't an important part of sort of the business of doing science and the practice as a scientist. So you can think of this as, again, just like the biggest picture pie in the sky. It's not necessarily that your lab is working on like accomplishing these goals start to finish, but just what are you taking baby steps towards? What are all the problems you need to solve along the way to some ultimate goal? So for instance, we're trying to develop commercially usable high temperature superconductors, or we want to develop cheap unrollable solar panels that could be mass installed on rooftops everywhere. Or we want to come up with targets for novel antiviral drugs. All of these things are part of the exciting part of the ultimate promise, and being able to know them cold and communicate them on command is very important. So in the previous example, I've slightly expanded the first sentence to give more background about the ultimate impact. So in this case, it might be, so we are performing quantum simulations on beryllium ions in an ion trap that might allow us to better understand high temperature superconductors. So now this is, this is why lower trap temperatures ultimately matter, is because this is the goal that we are working towards.
So the next component is where we actually address the actual question of your project. And this is usually a bit more narrow in scope than the impact, but it can still be quite broad in the context of your subfield. It might be helpful to think about this as like the hypothesis of an experiment. What do we think will happen? What are we trying to demonstrate? What are we trying to measure? And it could also be more abstract than that. Like, what's the main thing we're trying to learn? What's the way we should think about this phenomenon? Or going in a more concrete direction, is it possible to build this kind of instrument, for instance? And so it doesn't need to be super elaborate. Usually, in fact, it's quite straightforward. You can also have, as I said, questions at very different levels of abstraction or outlook. So, can be, is it possible to destroy cancerous tumors with light? How do we understand variation in patterns of finch beaks across different islands? Maybe can we manufacture something for a very specialized purpose that hasn't been done before, these single atom thick layers of silicon arsenide? Or can we come up with even just some general kind of method or algorithm that hasn't seen use yet? And going back to our kind of example paragraph, the question is actually discussed pretty briefly because it's really a straightforward component of the story. And so we need to obtain lower ion trap temperatures so we can get better measurements. And so we need to know how laser atom interactions affect temperature. This is very straightforward. This is something that we can measure. It's something we can characterize and quantify and ultimately understand completely.
So the next stop, and this is one that you might be very familiar with, is the problem. So the icon for this is the brick wall. I like to think of this as the head that you're banging your head against as you're thinking in the lab and trying to solve your everyday problems. But you can think of the problem as, why haven't we answered the question already? Or what stands in our way between posing the question and answering it? So it's like, this could be, you are trying to understand some microscopic biological phenomena, and it's that our microscopic setup in the lab has a too limited resolution. So we can't just go measure it right now. We need to make some upgrades to our noise reduction systems. Or maybe, oh, we want to plan out some experiments, but carrying out the full set of them would take years and years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. So we can't just go out and try a bunch of different compounds until we find one that has a property that we want. Or it could be that we have an algorithm that would work in theory for the kind of data analysis we're trying to do, but it's so inefficient given certain properties of our data set or the size of our data set that it's completely infeasible and intractable. And so we need something better in order to answer our question. So here it would be, for our evergreen example, is that manipulating our high precision lab apparatus is challenging. And so in order to save time in lab, ... The problem is stated is that, like, we want to get to lower atom temperatures in our trap, but we can't just go in and guess and check. If it were that easy, then we could just fiddle with the apparatus until we got to the lowest optimum temperature and say, okay, good enough. It's like, no, that would take forever. So we need to plan it. And so this behooves us to go down the road of, okay, let's model our apparatus as best we can and pre-plan what the best configuration would be. Then we move on it.
All right, so here we get to the method, and this is probably where you spend 90% of your time as a student and as a young scientist. Basically, what are we doing on a day-to-day basis to actually solve this problem and answer the question? So often this is about instrumentation. What kind of tools are you creating? Or maybe just adopting from another area and applying it? Are you writing algorithms? Are you implementing simulations? Some other examples could be, so maybe if you're doing some kind of analytical work, maybe it's, oh, we look at this problem through a set of simplifying assumptions. That's a great method. And a lot of this, I mean, it may not be directly answering the question that you set out to answer, but as you all know, it's a very necessary part of the work that leads up to that. And one thing that I also want to point out here is because the method is usually where you spend most of your time, it's the thing you're most intimate with, it's the thing you understand better than anyone else in the world. And as a result, it's also usually the aspect of your project that will differentiate you and your group from other scientists in your subfield. And so there can be lots and lots of people working on the same question or the same like broad impact, but often the methods are going to be what differentiate you and can make you stand out as an individual researcher to other people in your field. So going back to our example paragraph, as you can see here, just because you spend 90% of your time actually like working on the method doesn't mean that you should necessarily spend 90% of your communication on the method. Often it's actually the briefest part. So in this case, because we just ran into someone in the hallway, like we weren't going to go into all these details about like, oh, I had to like spend like 3 months debugging this one thing. I tried this algorithm and that algorithm, and like I had to wrap this part of the apparatus in foil. Instead, here we just address it very straightforwardly, very quickly. We set up a series of these integral equations and we solve them numerically. So that gives them some idea. So they know the kinds of tools that we're using, but we're not boring them to death about all of our daily struggles at the command line. And if they want to know more, of course, that's what we're here for.
Right. So at the end of the road for any research project is the result. So this comes in the form of the answer to your question. So you can think of this as what we know now that we didn't know before. You are reporting what you measured, understand, calculated, or observed. So this can mean, oh, we have found the particle scattering cross-section that we set out to measure, or we have shown that we can maintain qubit coherency for a long time scale, or now we understand that this is the exact mechanism of how this cancer drug works on a target protein. So again, this is what you have learned it's the moral of the story. It's what you learned at the end of the day. And being able to share this is a very important part of communicating your research. So here, our result comes at the end of the paragraph where we talk about, this let us predict, given a set of laser parameters, the optimal setup and the lowest possible temperature. So this is communicating what we gained as a result of the overall project. So, I mean, the paper, that's your career, but this is your science. This is what you learned. So know every one of these cold is our advice to you, and having just some mental framework for thinking about your own research project. And once you have a sort of really rock solid grasp on how you would talk about every one of those, it all becomes a matter, like you reduce your problem of communication to just knowing who is going to be interested in hearing what and how you present it to them and deploying it accordingly.
Okay, so now that we've covered these 5 core components, we're going to just talk about how to arrange them based on the situations that you encounter. So our first tip is to know your audience. If you remember our talk from yesterday about the statement of purpose, this should be no surprise. Your audience is your top priority in any form of communication. And so the reason we went and we broke down your project into these 5 components is to make sure that you know them very well yourself, as Stephen said, backward and forward. And that way, when you're actually talking to someone or writing to them, you know the ingredients so well, you can spend your time and energy focusing on how to arrange them to suit that specific audience. And so this way you can pay attention to details like how much time do you have with this person? How much technical detail do they really need from you? Are they even interested in your field in the first place, or do they want something else from you? Is it like worth discussing? What details are worth discussing about your project if they don't know the broader context? And maybe they are interested like more narrowly in you as a person or your specific project. And as you apply to graduate school and later on, when you interview for other academic positions, they will be interested in you as a potential colleague, and you want to be able to tell them exactly the information that they need to know to form that opinion.
So here's, I mean, so like Lauren pointed out, knowing your audience is super important. And here are some ideas as to how you might sort of divvy up the way in which you talk about your research, depending on your audience. So, right, like if I'm talking to somebody who's not in STEM at all, I would be like, okay, Grandpa, have you heard of the Schrodinger equation before? Like, you know, we don't talk necessarily about the methods that we're using or the, you know, the questions that like are what stump us in lab every day. Like when I'm talking, you know, to my uncle at Thanksgiving, I'll just lead with the impact. Like I'm like, okay, we're interested in computational energy materials. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about, you know, what we're trying to do in particular and what we learn, but I focus big on the pie in the sky because I mean, it's, you know, a lot of people haven't taken science class since like high school, you know, and so it's important to talk about, you know, what is the big picture and exciting about the research. When I'm talking to somebody who's like out of field in STEM, you know, I, you know, motivate the general work that I'm doing. But I know that they will probably have some familiarity with what sort of problems you'll hit up against. So, you know, maybe I'm talking to another experimentalist and they also are interested in like optics and lasers, in which case, like, you know, we can talk a little bit about what we're doing in lab all day, even if it's a completely different set of questions that we're working on. If I'm talking to somebody who's in field, like if I'm at like a material science conference and I'm a material scientist, I don't need to sell them on the promise of better living through materials, but maybe I'm going to talk more about the problem and the method, because at that point I'm interested in cross-pollination. Like maybe I'm talking to somebody who's an expert in the kind of algorithms that would be the perfect solution to my problem, but I've never heard of them before. So this is when it's really good to talk about sort of the nitty-gritty of your research, because then maybe there's opportunities for communication. Now, when you're talking to an expert in field, so the one, you know, the case that might be very important for you is when you're talking to professors who might hire you for graduate school. This is when this is when you talk about what you did. You talk about the skills that you learned. So this is like your method and your problem a little more so, but you really want to use those I statements and talk about what you did and what you accomplished and own those. And that comes in at the result. And also remember, experts who have been doing this for decades, you know, they are used to understanding sort of the core problems of the field. They're going to be interested in learning the new conclusions and the new information that's coming out on the bleeding edge of science. So definitely give that to them as you communicate.
Okay, so tip 2 is about jargon. We're all familiar with this, and we all know actually that not all jargon is bad. You have already seen probably that as you get deeper and more specialized in a given field, getting to know this jargon and deploying it can actually be really helpful. Like it can save you a lot of time when you're talking to your peers. It can cut down on confusion and make your speech more precise. But as we say, context is king, context is crucial. And so for most audiences, you really have to think about whether the jargon you're using will actually benefit the communication or whether it might just cause further confusion. And one thing we want to emphasize is that if you don't know how comfortable your audience is with any technical terms that you use, always just ask. This can take just a quick moment and it can be very helpful for your audience. And just, you know, are you familiar with this term? Does this ring a bell? And don't necessarily think that you're talking down to anybody by asking them this. Honestly, like you're more likely doing them a favor by clarifying. And when in doubt, always simplify, even to people in senior positions. And one way to think about the level of jargon you should use is think about how much like shared education that you have in common with this person you're talking to. So I'm a physicist, but if I'm talking to a biologist, so I only really know biology at like a 9th grade level. And the reverse is probably true as well. This biologist, they may have had contact with physics last like in high school or maybe early undergrad. And so that's kind of the level of technicality that I would be comfortable with for them and they for me. And also, even if you're talking to people in your field, like for instance, I mean, we're physicists, so this is all going to be in that context, but Like a condensed matter physicist and a high energy theorist may have much less shared knowledge in common than you really think, even if they're both like well-established professors at the top of their game, because really they last saw the same material like probably in undergrad. And so this might at least give you a ballpark of what kind of technicality, what level of jargon to use.
So when you're talking to somebody in a small group or one-on-one, it's completely okay to ask if they're tracking what you're saying, or as Lauren just said, if they're familiar with what you're talking about. Your audience may appreciate it if you ask simple questions along the way, so you can either ramp up the level of detail or sort of loop it back to something they know. I think one thing like to think about is that you can't necessarily control what your subject, like the person you're talking to, like what subjects they're familiar with and what they've seen before, but you can control what you share with them at what level and in what way. So getting that in, like if knowing your audience is the cardinal principle, like asking questions like allows you to sort of tune that on the fly in real time.
And we know these sound, you know, like common sense tips, but we bring them up because we see these all the time. And so what not to do, as you probably know, do not teach the subject unless you're really in a situation where that's your job, is to lecture to people. Yeah, it's probably not a good idea to do that in other communication contexts. Like think about all the times that your clueless uncle was just going on and on about the US tax code, and you're just like sitting there and like nodding, looking for ways to escape. Like we've all been there. So just be mindful to not do that unless that is what you're there to do. Also, often the purpose of your communication, it's probably not to give the audience kind of a pedagogical understanding of the material like they would get from a textbook. And so just ask yourself whether that's something that you should be focusing on. And of course, there's no need to just like run away with like rapid fire jargon when your audience is captive, especially doesn't really have a way to communicate back with you. It's your job to keep that feedback line open, whether they're actually following, and of course, whether they're actually interested in what you have to say in the first place.
So this next tip concerns when you're talking about things that you don't necessarily know the answer to. One of the best traditions of science is that people share ideas and insights with each other very freely. And one of the best case scenarios for scientific communication is not necessarily that you're communicating polished results that are already done, they're already published, they're in the journal, they're already printed, they're under the glass, and we can't really touch that anymore. I've had all my ideas about it. Like it's really good and exciting when you're talking about work that is still in progress, that is still being sculpted. Because then when you invite people to comment and give ideas, ask questions, or offer alternate interpretations, that's able to change the trajectory of your work for the better. So it really is okay to talk about things that you don't necessarily know the answer to. I mean, by definition, if you're only talking about things that you know cold, then there's less that you're going to get out of other people's ideas, reactions, and interpretations to your communication. And so when you sort of go off road a little bit, like it is a little scary, but it presents an opportunity for other people to contribute. It's just, well, Lauren will say this in a second, but it's important to demarcate when you are going off script, when you're going off road, and when you're talking about things that you don't necessarily know the answer to.
Right, and so we wanted to point this out because this is something that I certainly was paranoid about as a student, is not kind of knowing when to be speculative and when to like only stick to saying things that I knew 100% for sure. Because you might have been in, like, you might have seen this happen to other people. You might have been in a seminar where somebody says something and that's rather speculative, and they do mean it that way, but somebody else just didn't read it that way and, you know, tried to call them out for it. But, you know, like everything else, it really depends on your relationship with your audience. And yeah, you can always just say like, oh, you know, I don't know, but like this kind of does look like this other thing, although I have no evidence no like concrete evidence for that. And always, it's always okay to say, I don't know. You have to be honest about the limits of your knowledge for you and for your audience.
Right, that's the thing, is that people, it's been my experience that people are much more forgiving of speculation, and they are not, I think a lot of people respond sort of in a hostile way to somebody posturing, like when they're talking as to create the image of authority or the effect of authority when they actually don't necessarily know the full details of what they're talking about. So it's same level of like expertise here, but it's all just about like in how you talk about it and how you sort of like frame what you're saying. So be it really is okay to be explicit about this, and I think it actually really does matter for how this like overall how this like goes. And again, yeah, I mean, time and place. Like when you're in a qualifying exam, that's when you have to know your stuff. But if you're like presenting work that's half done to like your lab, like yeah, totally speculate. And so another thing that can take some getting used to when talking about your science is avoiding too much humility. And this is also something that like I have difficulty with sometimes, because sometimes it feels weird to like introduce work that your lab does, like to talk about, oh, here are all the things that people in my group do. And inversely, you may feel a sort of impulse to minimize your own contributions in the lab. And that's really selling yourself short. So like, I'm here to tell you, Lauren's here to tell you, be confident about owning what your contributions were. When you're talking about stuff you did, don't be afraid to use I instead of we. Another thing is that it is super, super, super normal for there to be twists and turns in any project, especially when you're just getting started in the undergraduate level. So unless there's a real case for making that a part of the story of your science, the audience doesn't necessarily have to know about the twists and turns. So if they're like, this is a piece of advice I saw, that like if there's like a slide in an overall talk that doesn't necessarily spark joy, like, the Marie Kondo way, like just cut it and the audience will never know that it wasn't there. Like, I mean, some of these twists and turns could be like, oh, well, when I showed up at my RU, we didn't really know what I would work on for a few weeks. And then in the end, we figured out that, this was a good direction for the project. Like it's entirely possible that your first draft might end up sounding like sort of this, like how I spent my summer vacation model. Well, first I did this, then we tried this, then we tried this, then we tried this. Like it's totally fine to present your story chronologically if you think it makes for a good scientific narrative. But not all the best research talks follow necessarily like this chronological order. Like these twists and turns are entirely normal. Any scientist will understand that.
All right, so our last tip is you're going to be practicing scientific communication, hopefully for the rest of your life. And just the most efficient way to get better is practice as much as you can. And I want to emphasize to you, especially as, students who are going to be starting graduate school soon, you should be aggressive about seeking out practice opportunities. Like ask affirmatively. To give talks, to teach, to write about your science. And not only does this mean like practicing doing it, but also getting feedback, like really asking people for feedback that you trust. And it's painful, but working through multiple drafts and practice talks as soon as you possibly can is the fastest way to improve. Empirically, that seems to be the law. I mean, like sit down your sibling and just, even if you have like 20% of your slides, just start there. And then that'll tell you exactly what you need to do next to improve this. And it'll be much better than you kind of like sitting there, like messing around with your slides, like speculating. And also a good benefit of all of this is that learning how to communicate fluidly about your research, it can actually give you a much better grasp of your research and the limits of your knowledge. And so one thing that comes up a lot is like, as a young student especially, is how we deal with audience questions that might be way over our heads. And like, how do you prepare for this kind of thing? And the answer is you can't really, but if you know your own material backward and forward, you know the context in which it applies, you know the limits of it, that way you can just focus your communication on like within that context, and you don't have to constantly worry about like, oh, am I missing something here? Am I missing something there? And yeah, just record yourself talking. It'll be worth it, as painful as it is.
Yeah, you'd be joining an honorable group of millions and millions of people who have trouble listening to the sound of their own voice on recording. But it is the fastest way. It is very painful, but it is very, 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 it's as helpful as it is painful, honestly. But yeah, so now that we've talked through your tips and tricks to keep in mind, as well as the principles that you can use to scaffold your own thinking about your research, we'll talk about some common research presentation formats and how you might apply these in practice as we go into the last 10 minutes or so of our presentation. So the formats that we'll talk about today are the elevator pitch. So that's kind of like where our original example came from, the research talk, the poster, and written summaries of your work.
So the elevator pitch, it might be something as informal as you run into someone in the hallway, you run into them in an elevator, and you have to give them a very, very brief rundown, who you are, what you do. Some conferences now actually formalize this into like flash talks or sound bites. You may have even given some of these. The parameters are you have a very short amount of time, 1 minute, maybe 5 minutes, like between that range. And it's informal, it's verbal, you have no visual aids. And so because you have such a limited amount of time, you have to be laser focused on your goal, which here is to leave a positive and memorable impression about who you are and what you do. And this is a great place also to focus on what differentiates you from other people in your field if you're talking to other scientists. So you want them to come away knowing, oh, okay, this person is so-and-so, they work at this university, this is what they do. If I ever need somebody like with that kind of expertise, this is the person I'm going to call. And whether or not they understand the details of how you do something is much less important than that impression of them knowing the kind of work that you do.
So research talks can take many different forms. But in general, they'll often have these things in common. So they're going to be medium to long duration periods of communication. They are formal forms of verbal exposition, and you have your slides as a visual supplement. Your goal is to tell the full arc of your work in a way that is more narrative than a scientific paper, but with the full gravitas of human-to-human interaction. So because you have all of your visual aids pre-selected and pre-ordered beforehand, they get to be organized in a manner that works for you. And so they are supposed to be there as a supplement to your communication. So structure your research talks and your slides in a way that plays to your strengths as a communicator. So this is a little bit like the statement of purpose thing yesterday, where it's a little like an interview where you get as many takes as you want. Here, you get to plot out in advance what visual aids you want to have. And so structure them and organize them in a way that works to your advantage.
So often this will be like a 60-minute talk, maybe a seminar or colloquium, and it's generally to people just in your department. We recommend this kind of hourglass structure where basically the entire audience, they should be following you as you motivate what your project is, you explain the question and why it's important, and then maybe what the specific difficulties are that your subfield faces. And it's okay as you go on that maybe about halfway through, maybe only 10 or 20% of the audience can actually track every detail that you put on your slides. That's totally normal. If it concerns you, you can always kind of just say that. Like, I know, this may only apply to a couple of the people here, but if it's an important detail, that's okay. But what you do want is everybody should be awake at the beginning and at the end. And so you do need a very strong results section because that's what people are going to remember from your talk. And so even if people get lost in some of the details, you want them to understand by the end, we did solve this problem, we did create this method, we did answer this question. Some kind of moral like that. The more pictures and the more video you have, the better. This is a great, great opportunity to specifically show that kind of thing. Often because you're going to be discussing a paper that's been written up somewhere else. And so you want to take advantage of the fact that you're there with them, with their eyes, where you can direct their eyes basically in real time. And often you can kind of just refer more technical details, be like, oh, here's our paper. Like, if you want to know more, this is where to look.
So most often, when you're going to be giving a talk at a conference, you're only going to have 10 to 15 minutes of the audience's time and attention. So here, I recommend spending probably not too much time necessarily like on like the problem or the method, but try to backload and talk about the results. So similar to what Lauren just said about the elevator pitch, that your goal is to be sort of memorable and straightforward about your research and what you did and who you are. Here, your goal is to communicate as memorably as possible sort of what you've accomplished. And so, of course, now this may have some situational relevance, like maybe if you're at a conference that focuses on a methodology, okay, fine, then that is a good time to lean into your method. Or if you're on a conference that's focusing on like a class of problems, okay, maybe lean in there. But focusing on what you did and why it matters is absolutely critical in these contexts. And again, 10 minutes is just way, way, way shorter than you think. And what Lauren just said, it totally holds. Usually if you're talking about work that is already halfway done, or excuse me, work that is already like pre-printed or even published, you can just refer your audience members to those. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about posters. So a poster is a short to medium duration talk where you have an informal verbal explanation of your research with a static visual aid. So unlike the slideshow, you don't get to have every kind of visual like animations or GIFs or videos at your disposal. You just have static ones behind you. So you can think of this as conceptually halfway between the elevator pitch and the research talk. So you want to be able to tell the story of the overall arc of your research in a way that closely, like it sort of resembles a conversation between two people, but you plan ahead of time what visual aids you're going to need to tell your story. So here's an example. Here's sort of a negative example of how you might want to lay out your poster. And so there are some things that are good here. The results are in the middle. So we can talk about, what we learned, what the data that came out of our experiment is. But I think that there's a missed opportunity here, and that lies in the left and right side of the poster. They're mostly just walls of text. So when you're standing in front of this talking about natural killer cells in vitro model tumors, either your audience is going to be reading that tiny font text and not paying attention to you, or they're going to be just looking at you, but you don't have any images that contextualize your intro, or you don't have any images that contextualize your discussion or your material and methods. So you may as well just be giving your talk in front of a brick wall at that point. So you kind of, if you use a poster like this, you sort of miss an opportunity to sort of buttress your presentation with visual aids to communicate every part of the overall arc. So here are some maybe more positive poster examples. So in this case here, the result is put front and center. So the result is very clearly stated with a clear image. And the background has an image associated with it. And then all of the parts, all the sort of like points in the story are told primarily through figures and images with text that sort of read sequentially tells the overall story. So the idea is that while we're working through like item 1 or item 2, the person who is receiving the poster presentation can sort of flip back and read a quick summary of what it is that's going on and what they're looking at. And so on the right, you can see that also the text is much bigger. There's a QR code in the upper right corner, so somebody can take the paper, the preprint away for later. But also the story is mostly told through images. Here's a radical example that I just kind of want to make you guys aware of. This is maybe an extreme of prioritizing the result over anything else or any of the other sort of 4 components of talking about your research. So this was kind of a buzz on scientific Twitter about it, a couple months to a year ago. And I think that this is, just to make you guys aware that this is what prioritizing the result in the extreme looks like, where almost all of the posters visual space is dedicated to the result. There's a QR code for people to learn more. And there's only sort of slight trappings about your overall method and intro and discussion of, all the other components, basically.
Okay, so the last format we're going to talk about is a written summary, like an abstract to a paper. And honestly, all we can really tell you is refer you to this Nature summary paragraph guideline. This is very popular. You may have seen it before. We highly recommend it. Just go Google it afterward, because so we're not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but we just want to point out that those 5 core components that we talked about earlier, they all kind of show up here. Like the beginning is this broad introduction to the field, why we're doing this in the first place. And then it goes more and more into the background and the methods, and then zooms back out to tell you what the result might be useful for and what we can look forward to in the future. So we highly recommend basically using this as a template. And even if you don't need to write this kind of summary for a given project, it might be helpful to just do it anyway. And that way it'll kind of be like a scaffold for other talks you might want to give about it, for instance.
Yeah, so here are some of the, oh, sorry, were you done, Lauren?
Yeah, I wanted to
get
to the next one.
Right. So yeah, I think we're almost at time. So maybe we'll just run briefly through this. Some of the things that you can do to practice are try to write down a 1-paragraph pitch for your research and see if you can include everything that we talked about. See if you can talk about the impact, the question, the problem, the method, and the result. Just the entire arc of your story, start to finish. What would it look like if you expanded it to 3 paragraphs? What would it look like if you compressed it just to 1 sentence? So of course, in 1 sentence, it doesn't need to be a super long sentence, but just what's the overall story in the most condensed possible form you can possibly think of. And can you maybe come up with 2 versions of each of these permutations? Can you come up with a version that would work for non-experts, or a version that would work for somebody in your field, such as a professor who does similar work? If you can sort of do this exercise through and keep a really good mental internalization of all the different ways in which you could talk about your research, depending on your audience, you will be in the 99th percentile of scientific communicators already. We really believe that good speakers are made, not born. And that just practice is absolutely critical for this skill.
Okay, so we wanted to leave you with this last sentiment, which is that you can, by and large, really trust your own judgment. So we gave you a bunch of tips today, but a lot of them are really common sense. And just go with your gut. Don't go with what you think makes you sound smart to other people. Go with what you know. Go with what you think tells the clearest story. Because we've all seen terrible talks, we've read horrible papers, we've had really unpleasant conversations about research, and you know that in your heart, it could have been much better communicated. And so you know how other people could have communicated better to you. And so use that knowledge and intuition and that judgment going forward. And we're all here today because someone somewhere has communicated their science to us in a way that's really spoken to us, that made us say yes, I will work long hours in the lab. Yes, I will study late into the night, because their communication of their love for science was so great and it got through to you. So that was a successful form of communication. And so I want you to use that as inspiration, that affirmative example, and to just pay that forward as you tell the world about your science. So thank you all very much. And these are great questions in the chat. And yeah, thanks everybody also for giving each other suggestions. These are great.
Yeah, no, this is part of the value. It's just that we have like, I think collectively among like our 50 participants, we have like years and years of scientific research experience that actually probably outweigh, you know, all of our organizing committee. So like, yeah, talk to one another and use each other as resources. I think we have a few minutes now before the keynote speakers start. So we're happy to take any further questions. Apologies if the chat's been moving quickly. So if we missed any, feel free to bump, like just resubmit them, and Lauren and I can get to them. But otherwise, I think we're just going to stay in this webinar for the keynote. Correct, Lauren?
Yep. Yeah, this question is really great. Do you have suggestions for replacements for less visual disciplines like math? I know with math concepts, for me, analogies are always great. Or if I can kind of come up, it doesn't have to be visual, but it has to be like a concrete example that I can really like get to know. I think that is really great. But yeah, it's a tough question.
Yeah, no, I think this is a real challenge for math in particular, just because a lot of the work is so abstract and I mean, I say this with the highest respect, honestly. But I think that, yeah, I think like if it is possible for your research, like to find the simplest possible like math concept maybe that has some analogy, like if there's some analogy to what you're doing that works for like functions of a single variable or something like that, like a very like the simplest possible case that has a possible analogy to what you're trying to do in some greater complexity, that might be a good place to start. Or if that simple analogy has like an image associated with it, then maybe you could use that. Yeah, excellent suggestion from another attendee. Yeah, examples are the gold standard for stuff like that.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephen. We're going to be switching over to our keynote that's going to be run by Michelle. Aaron.
All right. Well, thanks very much for everybody for your attention, and wishing you every success in your scientific communication.
And ask us more questions. We'll be here.
Hello there. How are you doing? Can you hear me, Dr. Nadya?
Oh, I didn't know you were talking to me. Sorry. There's
sorry.
I thought it was a follow-up question. Like, how is everyone doing? I hope you guys are all
actually, yeah. How is everyone doing? That's also good too.
Hi. No, it's good. It's great to see everyone. Hi.
Good to see you too. Like I've we've been communicating via email, so it's good to see an email to a face. So, so whenever you're
hanging in there, that's how I feel too. Hanging in there.
Oh,
keep
yeah.
hanging in there. Keep holding on as long as it takes.
Exactly.
So, are you doing my talk or am I doing my talk? Because there's animations in there.
So, because we are including captioning with all presentations, and we thought it'd be good for us to like set it up in a way that we can cut on the live caption. Now, if you would like to do it, then you know.
How are you going to know when to forward slides?
Right. So we were hoping that you would let us know by saying next slide, and then we can transition to the next slide.
Okay, I will try to remember. There's a lot of animations. This is going to be a little tricky, but we will.
Lauren, maybe click swap displays on top.
I'm sorry?
The button up top, swap displays, because what's showing is the presenter mode.
Okay, I see. I gotcha.
There you go.
Okay, I'll just say go ahead and click, and you can click on it. I'll make sure that.
Okay.
No, not yet. Are we ready to start?
Yes, absolutely. So we will get started with our next segment of our workshop. So hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Aaron. I will be acting as one of the facilitators for today's keynote speaker event. Just a little side note. So we're having 2 speakers come today, and each one of them will speak for a certain amount of time, and then we will open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions that you can think of between the start of the speech and the end of the speech for each speaker, then please feel free to post any of your questions in the chat box. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our first keynote speaker. She's a professor of physics at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, where she specializes in experimental studies of materials. She received her BS from Harvard University and her PhD from Stanford University, both in physics. In addition to maintaining a rigorous research program and teaching, she works to increase diversity in the physical sciences, particularly through mentoring, and is the former chair of the American Physical Society Committee for Minorities. Please help me welcome our speaker, Professor Nadya Mason.
Well, thank you, Misha. Thanks. It's really great to be here. Great to see everyone. Thank you for spending part of your Sunday doing this really important workshop. I think it's really, from what I heard so far, it seems like there's really great information to be heard here. So I was asked to talk about my path in physics as part of the career panel. How do you get on in academia? How do you get through STEM? So I'm a physicist. I'm a professor of physics, they said. And next slide, please. We'll start a little bit with my research. I do what's called condensed matter experiment, which is basically physics of stuff. Right? I do experiment, obviously. We study the fundamental electronics of nanoscale things, so really nanometer scale, 10 to the -9 meters. Examples are a lot of materials you may have heard of, things like carbon nanotubes and nanowires, graphene, topological materials, nanoscale superconductors. Go ahead and click. And when we study all of these things, the big research question we ask is, what happens as we scale things down to the smallest size? Now, it's an interesting problem for condensed matter physics, because on the one hand, we're used to thinking of things like bulk materials, things like gold or any sort of metal. And we know that these obey Ohm's law. We sort of know how these work. On the other hand, people think of physics, they think of atomic scale things, individual atoms, where you have wave functions and quantum mechanics. Go ahead and click. But the research that I do is somewhere in between these 2 scales. We look at things that are tens of atoms across. And so they still have wave properties, but they're also big enough to be individually contacted and measured. So I look at a lot of the electronic properties, and we'll take something like this image of a nanowire and put electrical leads on it and say, okay, what happens now? Can we see wave function effects, quantum tunneling, individual electrons moving on and off, things you'd expect quantum mechanically, but we can actually measure in a more macroscopic way. Go ahead and click. And this is relevant to studying just fundamentals of what happens in very small devices, as well as making small electronic elements. It's relevant for quantum computing elements, which are, of course, often mesoscale superconducting. So all of this sort of physics comes in. Next slide, please. So I'm just giving you, I'm supposed to, they gave me 20 minutes to talk, so I want to make sure there's time for questions. So I'm just going to say we do a lot of what I say fun physics. If you're interested, you can look at my website, which is somewhat updated, I think. But you can see some of these images here in the top left. There's an image of a carbon nanotube that has a superconducting contact in it. On the right, there's another image of a little flake of a one-dimensional material called graphene. It's only 1 atom thick. And so we measure that and we see what the properties are. On the bottom left, you can see that scale bar on the bottom left is, let's see, that's 200 nanometers. And so each of those little dots we fabricated as a superconductor that's 100 nanometers across, and we see what the properties there are. So if you have any questions, you can ask me more about that later. But I want to go on and talk about my path as well now. Okay, so my background, I was born in New York City, lived in DC, lived in Houston. I've lived all over the country, mostly on the coast till I landed here in the Midwest, which is very nice. In high school, I had a very strong interest in math. I did not have great science background. I didn't love my physics classes. My kids ask me now, in fact, one of them asked me yesterday, she said, is science always boring? Which is of course painful to my heart for her to say that, but what she meant is that she doesn't love her classes. And I said, no, I never loved my classes in school either. It was really research that got me into it. So I was good at math, didn't have a great science background, but I also did a lot of sports. I was an elite level gymnast. when I was through the age of 16. So I spent most of my time doing that. I also ran track in college, for example. I went to college at Harvard. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I believe I came in thinking that I liked the idea of physics. I didn't know very much about it at that point. So I ended up taking math and chemistry, biology, and physics just to see what fields were most interesting. And I realized that, you know, math was fine. Chemistry, I just did not like. Biology was pretty interesting. And physics was really interesting. And in fact, chemistry was an interesting experience for me because I took physics, well, just sort of like a standard first year chemistry. And I really just wasn't interested in the class until we got to the part about the periodic table and about how, you know, how the atomic shell structure leads the periodic table. And it all made sense from there. And I thought, oh my God, chemistry is amazing. This is just such a great topic. But then I realized, no, that was actually physics. So anyway, that's what got me thinking that I like physics. For those of you who, you know, people who are still in college, a couple lessons that I learned from college was that, you know, science is hard. It can be hard. It's not the easiest subject to major in. You know, I spent a lot of time in the physics library. I never felt like it came really easily like that to me, like I was ahead or anything like that. I just had to work really hard at my problem sets. And for those of you who may also find that you're working harder than some of your peers who are maybe in the humanities, for example, I think it's really good to think of the long-term benefits. Why are you doing this? What sort of career and profession are you setting yourself up for? And that really balances, to me, the extra work you have to put in as an undergraduate. The other thing, you know, when trying to figure out what you want to do now in graduate school, it's good to just think about what you enjoy thinking about. Right? For me, I realized that I did enjoy thinking about atomic shell structures. I actually enjoyed thinking about the microscopic origins of friction. That was something that excited my brain. And so when you're thinking of what specific field, think about what papers you enjoy reading, what topics you want to read a popular article about. And that alone will get you through most of, you know, college, graduate school, and beyond. I also want to mention that it should be what you like to think about best most of the time. You know, I remember always hearing people say, like, oh, you have to have a passion for your field. And I was never jumping up with joy every time I thought about physics, but I figured I'd like to think about it most of the time, and that was really good enough. I think it's hard to figure out something that you'll love all of the time. They mentioned here, for me, summer research internships are the most important factor in wanting me to be a physicist. I didn't love my classes. Some of it was interesting, but I didn't love doing problem sets, for example. But I got to work at Bell Labs, and also at Exxon Production Research Company, and also at Harvard as an intern when I was an undergraduate. And I really did love working in the lab. And when I realized that that could be a career, doing something that I was interested in, that I liked the practical aspects of, that's what really motivated me to want to be a physicist. And it also motivated the area of physics I went into. I worked in different areas over the summers, but I realized I really liked thinking about materials, which helped me go into condensed matter. Next slide, please. Okay, so after college, I went to graduate school. And I think that you hear a lot of people say, well, maybe not you guys, because you're at this workshop, but a lot of people will say, like, oh, and then I just went to graduate school, like it was a really easy and obvious choice. Now, for me, it wasn't necessarily an obvious choice. I did think about other things that I wanted to do. You know, like I said, I worked pretty hard in college. I wasn't sure that I was the best physicist out there. I wasn't sure I would even succeed in this field. So I knew that I wanted an advanced degree, because advanced degrees are crucial to, advanced degrees are crucial, or most of the time, the more advanced your degree is, the more likely someone is to pay you for independent work, especially if you're interested in something like research, which I was interested in. So I wanted an opportunity not for someone to tell me what to do, but for me to design my own project. And I knew that having more education would help me with that. So I knew I wanted to go somewhere for graduate school. I did think of going to, say, law school or medical school or even business school. I nixed business school pretty quick. I also nixed medical school pretty quick, so I just don't really like squishy things. I still think I would have been a really good lawyer because I like to argue. But yeah, at the time I realized that I kind of wanted to do something that had more impact in life. And for me personally, I felt like there were a lot of lawyers out there, but there were not a lot of people of color in STEM. And that was definitely something that motivated me at the time, that I could maybe have more of an impact if I stayed in physics and tried that out than if I went into another field. I also wanted to research and just learn more about physics. I was interested in my field. This was an opportunity to even get paid to learn more about it and get advanced training. And I don't like giving up on opportunities. I got paid for this. I didn't have to do anything in graduate school, it wasn't going out on a limb to try to go to graduate school. So I thought, why don't I try this and see how much I like it when I go more in depth into my field. Next slide, Trevor. Right, so here I've listed just what some of the pros and cons of grad school. Everyone has different thoughts about this, but for me, the pros are that it's intellectually stimulating. A flexible schedule, that's still true for academia. Being able to decide when you go into work, when you're not working is really wonderful, and it's hard to go back once you have that. I enjoyed still being within an academic community. When you leave academia, you find that people just aren't, it's not their job to think through complex problems anymore. And if you like problem solving, it's nice to be in a community of problem solvers. A PhD is powerful. With a PhD, even if you don't go on to be a professor, which many people won't, and don't want to, you can do a lot with a PhD. It shows that you're smart. It shows that you can problem solve, that you can work through things. And also I like doing science most of the time. Again, it wasn't that all the time I liked doing it, but I liked the practical aspects of it. For me, the cons about the reasons I wouldn't want to go to graduate school was that it was a lot of work for a long time. You will spend another 5 to 6 years in graduate school. If you go into academia, it's going to be another 2 to 3 year postdoc, and then 6 years as junior faculty before you get the stable tenure job. So it's a long process here, and some people are really ready to get on with real life and go out in the work world and don't want to do it. It's relatively low pay, depending on what degree you graduate with, you can get a job that makes 6 figures even right out of college sometimes. And in graduate school, you'll be making $25,000 a year. So, and even, it wasn't that I think among my friends who are grad students, we had great, we had fun, we had great lives, but you're certainly not making as much as you would in an industry. It's also sometimes difficult to be pushed intellectually. Even now, my brain just gets tired. I'll spend a couple hours thinking about science, and my brain's tired, it's fried, and I just want to not think about anything. And sometimes I just wish I had a job where I could just do stuff and not have to think about it, because it's hard. This is also one of the great things about it. You get to be pushed intellectually, so it keeps you really fresh, but it's not always easy. And sometimes people are tired of the ivory tower. Being in the bubble of academia, for some people, is not where they want to be their whole lives. You can click the next thing. But for me, it definitely was worth it. The pros really outweighed the cons, and it's a choice that I'm extremely glad that I made. Go ahead and click. Okay, so in graduate school, like I said, I went to Stanford. My PhD was on a 2D superconductor and metal insulator transition. I chose to work in condensed matter experiment because of these great summer research experiences that I'd had. I'd actually had many of my experiences were not in condensed matter. I'd had summer research in geophysics, biophysics, biochemistry, and I realized I wasn't as interested in those as I was in condensed matter. So that's what helped me decide what area I wanted to work in. I went to graduate school planning to work with a certain professor, and when I got there, I realized that I didn't like thinking about his research. I'd pick up the papers to read, and they weren't exciting to me, and it didn't feel fresh for me. And so I switched after 6 months into a different group. And the other advice is that I find graduate school can be hard and frustrating. I mean, I'm sure you'll hear more about this, but it's not always a straightforward process. It's an oscillatory process. A friend of mine drew this recently. It's an oscillatory process that has a slope. So fortunately, it has a slope going up, right? But there's ups and downs, and sometimes you're in those downs, and it feels like you start at the beginning again. And it's not quite true. You're still going up on this oscillatory process, but you have to understand that your research is not linear. There's things that succeed, times that don't succeed. You're pushing yourself to do something new. And for me, I went through my 3rd year of graduate school with no results and thinking that I just wasn't going to make it. I was never going to graduate. And then, I don't know, a year and a half later, suddenly everything started working and it was really fun. And I realized that I understood what I was doing. Everything clicked, and it was just this amazing experience. And at that point too, it just started being really fun. I started going on more hikes and just spending all night in the lab, and everything came together. So I think in general, as with many things, it's really hard and frustrating, then it can click and then be really fun after that. Next slide, please. Okay, I did a postdoc at Harvard. I went back to Harvard because my partner at the time wanted to be in Boston, and I was able to contact a faculty I knew there. So that was the cheap way of getting a postdoc. And then I applied to a bunch of places and landed at Illinois, which has a really great condensed matter physics program. And I've been here for the past 16 years. Next slide. Oh yeah, right. And I had 2 kids along the way. I had my first one as a postdoc, and then my second daughter I had in my 3rd year of faculty. I know I started my job with my first daughter when she was 5 months, and she's now turning 16. So that tells me exactly how long I've been here. This is them when they were young. Now they're very old teenagers. So I want to say, was it always an obvious, clear-cut path for me to go into graduate school to become a physicist? The answer is no. I definitely thought of other things to do at almost every step along the way. Did I always want a career in physics? The answer is no. I wasn't sure. I liked it, but I thought hard about other things that I could do. Was I always excited about my field or always interested in everything I was doing or about being a physicist? The answer is no. There are times I was interested and there are times I wasn't as interested in it. Next click. But, am I happy with the choices I've made and the position I'm in now? The answer is a really definitive yes. Next slide. Okay, so why do I think, right now I'm an academic. Of course, not everyone who gets a PhD should be an academic, needs to be an academic. But for me personally, having a research career is really wonderful. I love the variety of work. I love being able to focus on research and teaching and what's interesting to me. I love being able to set my own schedule to determine what I want to work on and when, what my hours are. It's a lot of hours, but you're still flexible within them. Academia is very social. It's something that when I was in college, I thought that people in science and STEM would kind of sit in their own corners and work on their little projects. And it's not true at all. I spent a ton of time collaborating with people, talking to people, going to coffee with people. And in fact, now in COVID times, I find that my academic scientist friends are the ones who are suffering the most from isolation. They're the ones who really need to interact more one-on-one and who are used to doing that, and they're finding a hard time not being able to do it. We get to travel, there's leadership opportunities. I now run a big 100-person research center and get to help set the direction of research for others. And there's also a lot of outreach opportunities, which are really important for me also. And I get to decide how much of that I integrate into my work. Next slide. But it's not always easy, right? This is the one thing, that it's not the sort of job that I go home every day and I was like, well, I'm done with that. I'm always thinking it can be frustrating, as with many things. You're always pushing. Next click. And in general, for me, the hardest and the best part of academia, and I think this is true both for graduate school and beyond, even for undergraduate, is that I'm continuously thinking and challenged, right? I'm always, you have to come up with ideas. You have to meet new opportunities. You have to train new students. You have to write new grants. It's hard to be challenged a lot. On the other hand, I think without those challenges, I wouldn't be having as much fun. I wouldn't be as interested in what I do, and I wouldn't be renewing myself, which is really, it keeps you young, right? Intellectually young and emotionally young, which is something that I think is wonderful. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm almost done. I just want to mention some of make sure I'm almost done. I have to remember what my slides are. Yep, this is the last one, second to last one. Just to say, this is some of the other things I do. A lot of people think that a professor just teaches and researches. I have a group where in the past just 9 years, I've had many graduate students, undergraduate, postdocs, high school teachers and students working in my lab. I've taught all sorts of classes, written many papers. I give a lot of talks, at least 10 talks a year around the world, write lots of grants. I need at least 3 or 4 active grants at all times to fund my research. It needs at least $500,000 to $750,000 a year to run. I do a lot of service to the field. I was on, there's a decadal study on materials research sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences. I was one of 20 people who helped write that. I was on the board for a journal, Physical Review B. I was on the general council of the American Physical Society, which is the largest society of physicists. I was on what's called the Defense Science Study Group, learning about the defense science needs. I'm on the advisory boards of, I think, 4 or 5 different centers and institutions right now. So all of this keeps me busy, as well as the fact that I'm directing this materials research center, like I said, which I really love a lot. It's interesting, but it's also taking up a lot of time. It's part of my job. And then I also do a lot of service to the community. Like I said, service is really important to me. So as mentioned, I was chair of the APS Committee on Minorities. I was on the Gender Equity Council. I give a lot of talks. I'm on advisory boards. I do things like, I had a local TV show I went on. I gave a TED talk. These are things that you can, next clip, these are things that are all, it's a little crazy. There's a lot here, but it's really interesting. It can be really engaging, exciting. I get to choose what I want to do among these things. And I also mentioned that being able to do outreach and service is really integral to my work. Next slide. And this is the last slide. I can answer more about this, but to give people advice for thriving in STEM, I've come up with six points that have been honed over the years. Number 1 is work hard. You won't get anywhere in the field without putting in the time. There's no substitute for that. Try to do what most interests you. Again, the most there is important, not what interests you all the time, but what most interests you, because then you'll have the engagement to work hard at it. It'll be interesting to work hard. Plan ahead and prioritize. This is one of these things about balancing, especially being a woman of color in STEM, having a family. I have to be aware at all times what my priorities are, what I care about, and why I'm doing it. That allows me to block out noise and allows me to manage my time and to focus on the things that are important to me. Number 5 is be healthy. I think a lot of us forget the toll that academia, that life takes on us. And if we're not attentive to our own health, making sure that that we exercise, that we eat well, that we take care of our brains and our emotions, it's very easy to just sort of slowly fall apart. This is true for many fields, but academia can be more intense in some sense, and graduate school can be intense. So taking care of ourselves, being healthy is important. The last point is swimming in your own lane. This is something that I stole from another person's, an article that I read about a swimmer who was always running swimming races and would always come in second and was really frustrated. And she went to her coach and said, why am I always coming in second? And the coach said, that's because when you're swimming, you're always looking to your left and you're always looking to your right, and you're trying to see what the competition is doing, and you're not just focusing on getting to the finish line yourself. And this is, to me, maybe the most important thing. Let's all focus on our own finish lines and make sure that that's the most important thing that we're doing as we progress through our lives and our careers. Okay, and with that, I will end and take any questions that you guys have.
Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, you can place them in the chat box. So I guess while we're waiting for questions, I have a question for you.
Yes.
So you mentioned about managing your time. Yes. And staying focused on things that are very, very important to you. Yes. I guess my question for you is, how do you manage to do that? Like, what techniques could you give us that helped you with staying focused on your task?
Yeah, so there's time management things. Yes, so I do get asked to do a lot of things, as will probably all of you. Everyone gets asked to do a lot of things. I live by my calendar, for one, right? I have to know when the calendar is getting full and when it's not. But I also, right now, I have internal metrics of what I feel like I can do at this point. So I feel like I can give 5 talks a semester. And so in the beginning of the semester, I will schedule those 5 talks. And I know that I want them spaced out by 2 to 3 weeks to give me time to recover in between and do my normal job. And so I space those out. And after that, I don't accept anymore. Or I try not to, right? Things sometimes get filled in, but that's a sort of thing, right? Or I know that I'm going to do X many. I mean, this is weird having actual numbers, but it's important because it allows you to keep track. So I do keep track of exactly what I do, right? 5 talks, they go on my calendar, that's it. How many boards am I on? I'll be on 5 boards. Okay, I'm not going to be on any more. So after I'm on those 5 boards, each of those has an annual meeting. I say no to everything else, right? Unless I say no to a board or something. I schedule every day, week, and even longer. I have a sense of when my deadlines are and what's due. And so I have a running list every day of what I plan to do and what needs to happen so I can get it done within the next week. And I have a running schedule for every week of what needs to happen, every month of what needs to happen. You know, it's an easy, I keep some of it, I just keep on my phone as notes, right? And even, I hate to say, even for weekends, you know, it's numbered. It's go shopping, do laundry, give talk, right? Do something, and they have little numbers on them and sometimes little times on them of when it's going to fit in. Because it's also important for me to have time for my family. And if I don't schedule in when all these things are happening, then I'll end up spending all my time on other things and I'll never spend time with my kids. And so this way, when I schedule in stuff, I know, okay, Sunday afternoon, you know, after this talk from 12 to 5, we're going biking, and that's scheduled and nothing's coming in there. And so it's really scheduling things and taking chunks of time to make sure you set apart for yourself and for other things that you care about also, and scheduling those in advance. You know, I make sure that I schedule hikes, vacation time, time out on my calendar well in advance so that nothing goes in there.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's good to work hard, but also play hard too.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. So we do have another question. Was it awkward switching advisors? Do you have any advice should we encounter the same situation in the future?
Yeah, it was certainly awkward. Yeah, because I talked to this person before I went to graduate school, and so he knew that I was coming. He had my desk ready for me. He had talked to people I'd worked with. But it happens all the time to advisors. And so when I did it, I felt weird about it, but I certainly didn't want to be stuck in a bad situation for 6 years in graduate school and setting the tone for my life in a situation of, doing research I wasn't interested in. And the advisor took it extremely well. So I just went to him and said, hey, I know I came to do this, but I find that I'm just, this is not a topic that I'm as excited about as I thought I was. I think I'm going to try to talk to other people about research. And he understood, because now as an advisor myself, I realize people do this all the time. And so as awkward as it is, you have to be able to stand up for yourself to say what you want. And for people on the other side, they expect that. They expect someone to say, it's not working, it's not interesting, I need something different. If you don't speak up, they assume everything's fine. And that's not the way advisors want it to be either. So it was a little awkward, but now I realize it actually wasn't, right? Because he knew. I can actually read these questions. Do you want me to read the questions, Misha, or are you going to?
You're more than welcome to read the questions too.
Okay. You go ahead, Misha. You can read it. I'll just listen.
Oh, okay, perfect. Here we go. I was wondering, how did you navigate the academic world, especially in physics? Being a woman of color, perhaps people having preconceived notions about you. How did you go about dealing with that if you experienced it? Yeah,
absolutely. That happens all the time. Of course, because people look at me and they don't expect me to be there. So, in fact, I realized that even when I was in graduate, you start in graduate school and I'm the only woman of color in my graduate class, right? I think maybe in the entire physics program, physics graduate program. So this is kind of where this, swim in your own lane came in, because what I realized is if I thought about what people thought about me, then I would just go crazy. I can't control that, right? I can't control people's preconceived notions. So I have to be able to just do my work without thinking about what others are thinking about me, to follow, to have my own goals, my own expectations even, right? My plan is to do this project and find out this research and write this paper, right? Without wondering about whether other people think I can or can't do it. Now, there are times when people will actually, either demean you or say something or actually, actively put you in a situation where you have to respond. And I've been in that situation, and I do tend to respond pretty upfront about things. Like, I don't appreciate you saying that to me, or something like that. It's good to let people know that they can't just say anything to you. And you can say it, and if it's a lab mate, you can say it in a you don't have to be doesn't have to be mean. You have to work with people, but you can also just say outright, like, I don't find that funny, and I've had to do that a lot of times. And I find that the more I do that, the more people respect me, or at least they don't say things to my face anymore. So that's how I've navigated.
Perfect. So we're right at time for our next speaker. If you'd like, Dr. Nadya Mason, you're more than welcome to answer some of the remaining questions through the chat feature.
Sure, I'll do that.
Okay, perfect. So everyone, thank you very, let's give a round of applause for Dr. Nadya Mason for giving us a speech and giving us wonderful advice about time management and navigating through academia. Thank you very much. So now we are going to move on to our next speaker, our next key speaker, which I'm really excited about learning more about Dr. Sherry Ann Brown. So she's the director of cardio oncology at, I'm going to butcher this, I'm so sorry, Fraudtert Hospital and Milwaukee VA Medical Center, and assistant professor at the Medical College of Wisconsin. She received both her Doctor of Medicine and Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut Health Center in the combined medical scientist training program. She has been highly involved in many organizations that are led by women or individuals of color, including the American Heart Association and American College of Cardiology Women and Cardiology Sections, the Women's Heart Alliance, and the Association of Black Cardiologists. Please help me welcome our speaker, Dr. Sherry Ann Brown.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It means a lot that the organizers have been very thoughtful as they've put together speakers for you. And I'm looking forward to spending the next 20 to 30 minutes with you and hearing more about what's on your mind as I tell you some about my journey as well. Next slide. And I'd like to start this journey by having you think about those many different steps in your life so far and how they've gotten you to where you are. And recognizing that all of the decisions that you've made, all of the opportunities that you've availed yourself of, they led to this point, and that will continue to be the case over the course of your career. Next slide. The first thing I want us to think about is what fascinates you, what has fascinated you over the years, and what continues to fascinate you now. And that will change over time, but some of it will be constant. In my case, when I was in high school in Jamaica, I was fascinated by the body's circulatory system out of biology, chemistry, physics. In terms of what I would do in medicine, I thought that was the most interesting. But to take a step back from that, the way the system works in Jamaica at the time when I was in high school, in 9th grade, you'd have to decide what track you wanted to pursue. Do you want to go into the science track or the business track or the architecture track and so on? And so for me, I chose the science track because I knew that out of all the things I was studying, what I seemed to be stimulated by the most and what I got prizes for the most was science. And in 9th grade, once you choose that science track, then science split into physics, chemistry, and biology. And it was starting then that I realized how much I enjoyed physics. And so in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, I really enjoyed thinking about things like the potential energy and kinetic energy and how they interchange at the top of a waterfall versus the bottom of the waterfall. That sort of thing was just interesting to me. And what was most fascinating was how that applied to the things around me. And when I thought about what I wanted to do one day with my science career, I thought about doing a physician, about being a teacher, being an engineer, and I thought I wanted to be a physician to use that science to really hands-on help people. And so in that setting, I thought about in biology then, which you have to know as a physician, what did I enjoy the most? And that's how I came to the circulatory system. And so going on into college then, I knew that even though I was going to major in physics, because that was my favorite science, hands down, I also would be pre-med. I also would be doing biology, chemistry, math, English. I also would be doing all of the things I needed to fulfill my liberal arts requirements. So I did music, sociology, psychology, thought about doing economics. And having that broad background was important to me because I knew that all the patients that would be coming to me would also be whole individuals with rounded backgrounds, and I wanted to be the same. And in that setting too, I received a scholarship going into college. It was part of the acceptance package, the university scholarship, and you could accept it or not accept it. And so I said, yes, of course, if you want to give me more money, I'll take more money. And so I had less loans than everybody else on financial aid and more scholarship. And as part of the university scholar package, we were required to do research every semester of college. And that research was to be done for no more than 6 hours a week in the first year, no more than 10 hours a week every year after. And that research we were paid for as our work study. And that's how I got into research. Of course, we had experiments we needed to do in high school, but it seemed to be part of the curriculum. It wasn't something I was doing outside of classes that was a whole other type of way of thinking or studying. And so because I was a university scholar, I did research for all 8 semesters of college. And similarly, I was given an advisor in biology because everyone knew that I was going to go to med school. But that very first semester, I talked with a biology advisor, very frankly, and explained that although I'm going to medical school, physics was my favorite subject, my favorite science. That's what I was going to major in. And so I wanted an advisor in physics. And it was very easy to make the transition. And so I switched to an advisor in physics, was doing physics research with condensed matter, solid state physics. And the particular work I was doing involved watching some of the equipment freeze for hours at a time. And I would fall asleep on the couch. And so I had to ask myself, what kind of physics research do I really want to do? And so my physics advisor, he's the one that approached me and said, Sherry-Ann, we need to have a heart-to-heart. I wonder if this is really the right lab for you. And so we both were on the same page that I wasn't doing what I was passionate about or what stimulated me in any way. And so then I talked with other physics professors in the department to think about what else could I do in research as a physics major. And it turns out that because everybody knew I was pre-med and I was fascinated with the circulatory system, the heart, the blood vessels, I ended up working with a physics professor who was collaborating with a biomedical research lab at Harvard and looking at the blood samples of patients and looking at data from samples on microarrays to see what happens with how the genes are expressed and how is that different in men versus women, in those who have a disease versus those who don't have the disease, those who may develop disease but are still without symptoms. And that fascinated me. And so I was able as a physics major to join a team of individuals that included a biologist, a chemist, a mathematician, a computer engineer. It involved folks who are doing work in the wet lab with the pipettes and the microarrays. It involved folks like me who are on the computer coming up with a quantitative analyses to think like a physicist, to think about how do we solve this puzzle? How can I be the quantitative person, one-off on this team to think through the biology, but to think about how we can use the way that we think in physics to complement the way that others might think in biology or chemistry, and how can we as a team come up with some answers to help current and future patients. And so that was fascinating to me, to think about how I could use the fact that physics was my favorite science and apply that to biomedical science. And so for some of you, you may be thinking about different things that you're interested in and how can you bring them together. And if you're passionate about various things, you can find ways to have those paths connect. Next slide, please. And so then as I went on into medical school, what I ended up doing over the course of my career is a series of combined programs. I did a combined bachelor's and master's program in physics with a concentration in biomedical science, bioinformatics, biotechnology. And then I went into a combined MD PhD program at the University of Connecticut Health Center. And while at UConn, while I was doing the PhD, I had the opportunity to shadow a general cardiologist. And during that time, I noticed that most of his patients were older, they were already in heart failure or atrial fibrillation. And I wondered what happens to younger people in their 40s to 50s or even younger before they develop various forms of heart disease. And I thought, I'm going to create something called preventive cardiology. I Googled and it turns out it existed. And so I realized I can think about how to develop a career with prevention of heart disease as a foundation and consider how to tailor my research in that setting. For my research, I did the PhD in biomedical science and I was in the cell biology department because I wanted to remain general. the research I ended up doing was making computer models of the body and particularly the brain, because that was the lab that seemed best suited to the sort of theoretical work I wanted to do. And doing work with biochemistry or electrophysiology in the brain, or with personalizing the computer models to what was found from individual patients' blood samples or from mice or rats, to be able to make predictions for therapeutics that might be helpful for humans. That was the main lab doing that. And so if I had to do that with modeling the brain, that's what I chose to do. And so one of the things that you were learning as you think about grad school and your science career is the fact that sometimes you choose a lab based on the tools that you can gain that can be used in whatever field you develop. And so I learned how to create computer models, how to think about computational biology, how to think about computational modeling, computational medicine, how to learn in that sphere, and coupling that with some experiments that I did do with mouse models, cell lines, confocal microscopy, imaging, and so on. How do you think about gaining the tools you need in order to apply that to what you want to do with your career? And sometimes you also choose your lab based on a mentor. Sometimes you recognize there's someone that seems really good at helping people find their paths, even if it's circuitous, and develop into being the best scientist you can be, even if the topic itself may not be what you spend the rest of your career on. So those are some of the things that I learned as I determined what lab I would be and what research I would be in. I also checked out labs doing work on cancer, checked out labs doing work on the heart, because I was always in this flux of, do I really want to be a cardiologist? Do I really want to work on heart disease? Do I really want to help cure some kind of cancer? And so I had those thoughts in the back of my mind while I continued doing work in precision medicine and personalized medicine and computational and systems biology, its whole sphere. Next slide, please. And so I realized that I could use the knowledge that I was gaining in the MD portion of my program and the PhD portion of my program and find ways to bring them together. Whenever I was in an MD class and I felt like, this is over my head, I'm just gonna be a scientist. Or whenever I was in the PhD class and I would think, I'm just not getting this, maybe I'll just go be a doctor. I'd realize that sometimes you're not gonna get what's happening. Sometimes you're not gonna get what's going on in the world around you. For example, in the pandemic, many of you might feel that way all the time. And you have to recognize that still it's up to you to determine your journey to get back to what fascinates you, what you're concerned about, what knowledge you're gaining, and how you want to apply that in the future. So those are some of the things to think about as well. And so for me, I spent a lot of time shadowing different cardiologists in various areas within cardiology. And then one day I saw an email about a pilot project in cardio-oncology. And I learned that there's an emerging field within cardiology where you especially care for the hearts of individuals with cancer or with a history of cancer. And so I realized that as much as I always knew deep down, no matter whether I went into psychiatry rotations or surgery rotations or radiology and loved them and wondered, maybe I should be an orthopedic surgeon. But at the end of the day, I always came back to cardiology. And so learning that there was a new emerging field called cardio-oncology was helpful for me, because then I realized I could apply my desire to be a cardiologist to having part of my focus be in individuals with cancer, recognizing that having cancer or being treated for cancer raises the risk of heart disease higher than in the general population that hasn't had cancer. And knowing too that my introduction to cardio-oncology was through learning about a research project, a research pilot project was important. Again, recognizing that no matter what sort of field we choose in science, there can be applications across the board, whether you choose to be a medical scientist or biomedical scientist or physician scientist or any other kind of scientist. And so for those of you who are fascinated with the body and fascinated with medicine, but you don't want to be a physician and you think you want to be a scientist but do something with the body, then there are lots of different ways of doing that. And so if one of those paths for you is being a physician scientist, then you can apply any science that you study or that fascinates you to that part of the body. And so for me, being able to leave the MD PhD program at University of Connecticut and then go on to the clinician investigator program at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, helped to continue along that path. And as much as I'm talking about research from leaving high school till now, I must tell you, it wasn't until about 5 to 10 years ago that, for you, that might seem like a long time, but for me now, that seems like a short, recent time. It wasn't until 5 to 10 years ago that I realized that as much as I knew in 9th grade, 10th grade and 11th grade, that being a physician was part of my calling, I didn't know at that time that being a scientist was also part of my calling. I didn't realize that till 5 to 10 years ago, when I realized how much it meant to me and to others who supported me and read my work to be able to think through problems, to come up with discoveries, make predictions, find ways to implement those ideas, and then write about them and synthesize them in a way that no one has ever done before. Being able to do that and give that to the world makes such a difference for the fulfillment in my professional life, as well as for my supporters and those who read the work, and help me realize that that also is a part of what I know I need to be doing with my life. And so for you, perhaps you're thinking about ways in which to use science for the rest of your life and thinking about how does that fulfill you? And so think about, next slide, please, the opportunities that you come across, and think about whether, for me, it would have been in medical and radiation oncology as well as cardiology. Think about, for you, what are some of the opportunities you have to expose yourself to things that seem interesting to you, but you don't yet understand, and you feel like somehow that's related to what you think you're meant to be doing. And so search for those opportunities, find them, and take advantage of them and avail yourself of them. And join hands, link arms with others like you, with others who can support you and help you become who you want to be. Next slide. And so for you, I want to take off everything I've said about me and just have you think about your journey. Think about what has always fascinated you, or what is starting to fascinate you. Think about what concerns you the most and what you wish you could do something about. Think about the knowledge you need to gain to be able to do that. And then consider what opportunities you need to find, or what opportunities actually sometimes do fall into your lap, and consider how can that help you get to where you want to be. Next slide. And as we continue in this, I want to share with you another part of the whole package of who I am professionally. I am a cardiologist who especially sees patients with current or prior cancer. I especially focus on preventing heart disease in addition to treating it. And I also write about my experiences as a physician, as a scientist, as a person, as a woman of color. I write about all of these things. This is one of my favorite poems to share that was written back in it was written probably in 2011 or so, but it was published in 2014. It was written when I was actually writing my PhD thesis. I had written a poem because I was talking to somebody and she asked me about the implications of my research for people, and she was a dancer. And so I thought about, what if someone who was a dancer had the disease I was studying? What would life be like for them? And I wrote a poem about it, and it was published in a newsletter for the organization nationally around that disease. And then I wanted to have poetry in my PhD thesis because that's how I think outside the box. And so my advisor suggested I could have it as a chapter in my thesis. So then I thought, well, I need more than one poem for a whole chapter. So I wrote about 9 poems. And this was one of them. And it was published in 2014 in Minnesota Medicine. Just one more step. I could give in to the challenge before me, or yet I could give out. Alternatively, I could give all I have in me, all I have left to step. I could stay in this position. I'm sure I could find justification. But just as I could choose to stop, I could instead choose to step. If I could take just one more step, I know I will be all right. I know I won't be back at the start. I know this with all my heart. If I could take just one more step, I will be closer to the finish line, where an earned yet gracious victory will be mine. If I could step, I know I'll make it. I know my dreams will come true. I must keep on stepping, whether with my pen or my finger, with my voice or my pointer, with my legs or my walker, with my feet or my wheeler, with a clear gaze or through the haze, with my muscles cooperating or with me overcoming, I must just step. With the software freezing or running smoothly, running out of memory or making things easy, I must step. With the tears and the fears, literally and figuratively, respectively, I must just step. Until I achieve my goal, and until the race is o'er, I must keep on stepping. No matter what stage, I must still take one more step. And so even in those moments when I questioned my identity and whether I was meant to be doing what I was doing, even in those moments when I felt like none of the experiments were working and the software just kept freezing and I wouldn't make any progress, I knew I had to keep on stepping. I had to keep writing that thesis, doing those experiments, working on what I knew I had to do to get to where I needed to be. And so people in medicine, science, careers across the world enjoy this poem because it speaks to all of us. And you can find it in that publication on the bottom left, or next slide, please. Or you can find it on Amazon. It will be published in the 8th book in the series that I have on Amazon under Dr. Brown Cares. And so that's what I have for you today. And I look forward to your questions, your comments, your concerns, your objections. Know that you're not alone, and those feelings that you have, you're not the only one having them. Next slide. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Sherry Ann Brown. I really appreciate you taking the time to give us insight and sharing that wonderful poem. So I noticed that this is something that I've, while we're waiting for questions to come in, this is something that I've noticed about a lot of people in STEM. They tend to have that artistic side of them that keeps them grounded, that keeps them from losing control. And when did you first realize that artistic writing poetry side of yourself help you keep that inner peace?
Sure, thank you, great question. For me, it was actually when I was 15 years old and I was in high school and realizing that there were things happening in my life that I just didn't understand and needed to share. And so I started writing poetry, just writing about how I felt. And that became a habit for me. I'd share with my friends, I'd share with my family. And then when I went to college, I'd share it with everyone there. And so there'd be talent shows in college. And so I'd get on stage and I'd share my poetry. And then people would have me print them and they'd frame them. And so it was beautiful to know that the things I wrote would touch and reach other people too, because we all have lots of different kinds of experiences and feelings and thoughts. And then the American Society for Cell Biology in 2017 in December in DC had Cell Slam. And I happened to be there that year. And so I thought, oh, how great. It was a competition where you could share about your work, whether it was cheerleading, singing, poetry, rapping, whatever. I think I was the only person who did it through poetry. I wrote it about half hour before the event. Then I shared my poem during the event, and it was very well received by the audience. And that's when I first started writing about science. And I realized that I could help others understand the research, whether it's writing a paper or writing a poem about it. And so since then, I've continued to write poems about the science and about medicine, about patients, about physicians, about healthcare. And that's what led to those books of poetry on Amazon, realizing that one of the ways in which I really enjoy expressing myself and sharing my thoughts is through poetry. And so the more I write, the more I share with others. And it always means a lot when a scientist or a physician or a patient finds themselves in the poem and recognizes that someone else out there might have a sense of what they're going through. I think that makes all the difference with the work that I do. And many of you also have multi-talents. Many of you are musicians, or you're dancers, or you're great at sports, or whatever it is. You don't have to give that up to be a scientist. You don't have to give that up to pursue research. all of those things make you who you are, and giving up on those things will mean that you're not really fulfilling all that's inside of you.
Wonderful advice. Thank you very much. Oh, also you mentioned your book that's going to be on Amazon. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that, as well as the link for where we can access it?
Sure, absolutely. So if you go to Amazon and you search for Dr. Brown Cares, it should come right up. And in fact, while we're talking, I'll find it for you and I'll put it in the chat. And it's one of the things I did because folks have always asked me to publish my poems. And I realized that a lot of the poems that I write are great not only to be in medical magazines or journals, but for everyone. And so in order for the poetry to be accessible truly to everyone, I decided that putting them on Amazon would be the best decision so that everyone can access it, no matter whether you're in science or whatever else that you do. You'll be able to find it and share it with others and enjoy it too. And so it's for physicians, it's for scientists, it's for patients, healthcare providers, family members, caregivers. It's for everyone, because there's a little bit of everyone in all of the poems, and the experiences go across the board. And if you're on social media too, I have my handle on all the slides there. The most one I use professionally is Twitter. There's a huge cardiology community on social media, a huge scientist community on Twitter. And so join us there as well. And you can check out the websites too. The picture that you saw in the slide with the walker and the crutches and so on, that's from the website lyricalmezzanine.com, where I have various photographs I've taken of putting things together that represent what's in the poems. And so if you want to see some more of those pictures that go along with the poems, then it would be lyricalmezzanine.com. That's on the next slide as well. And so you too can find ways to share all of your magic with the rest of the world.
And that's very important too. You have to keep that balance, that peace and the science. So yes, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with our active participants as well as our live streaming participants. And I want to give a little bit of a round of applause. And I know like we can't really hear it, but a round of applause for both of our speakers for giving us this very insightful speech and presentation. And I hope that this all resonated deeply with all of you. So this ends the webinar portion of our workshop. Thank you all for participating and watching us live. And for everyone else who's an active participant, we're going to move on to our statement of purpose feedback events. So stay tuned.
Stephen, you leaving?
Great, thank you. All right, so is everyone ready for the second part?
Yes, that's at a different link.
Yep.
And we can cut off the live streaming.
Thank you so much, Sherry Ann. Thank you so much for being one of our keynotes. It was great.
All right, I'm gonna hop over.
Yeah, is everyone gonna hop over? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful.
Thank you again, Dr. Sherry Ann Brown.
So this room is going to, I think if someone wants to end the live stream.
I don't have any power.
So it would be Laura.
Yeah.
Although I guess when the meeting ends, the live stream ends as well.